Hey folks, before we get started today, I just wanted to pop on here and tell you a couple things you can do for props. Now, for today's class, I've asked that you bring a couple of blankets. You can sub those in with large towels. So maybe if you have like 2 or 3 of the big towels, that could work as well. The other thing that I've suggested that we have is a couple of yoga blocks. These are awesome investments. I use them all the time, but no need to buy them if you don't plan on it or don't want to. A couple things that you can use for this particular practice instead are things like a couple of same size water bottles. We're going to be getting into a pose where we're in sort of a lunge, and it can be helpful in order to practice this kind of yin style practice where we don't go as deep into the posture as maybe is our normal capacity. It can be helpful to prop up the upper body. So if you have something to lean on, like a couple of water bottles, or I grabbed a couple books here, but I made sure that they're pretty similar in size. You can also use something like that to kind of lean on and help essentially bring the ground a little bit closer to you. Other than that, having a yoga bolster is always nice, but you definitely don't have to have one. We can use a blanket or a couple of blankets and in position of a bolster instead. So that's it for today. That's all you'll need. Just definitely make sure you have the blankets, and I'll walk you through how we're going to use them when we come into the poses. So go grab those if you don't have them, and then we'll get started. And I like to sit with my hips on a blanket just so that they're a little bit higher than my knees. And then just take a pause here, option to close down the eyes or soften your gaze. And start to feel into the space that you're in. So maybe noticing the temperature in the room that you're in. Maybe the feeling of your legs grounding down into the earth beneath you. And then start to bring some awareness into your breath. So noticing if you can drop into that without trying to change the breath at all. Just passively watching it if you can. It's okay if you do try to change it. That's a natural human response. And just trying to notice where you feel the breath the most in the body. So maybe that's in the side ribs, the diaphragm, maybe the back of the throat, or the nose. Stay there for a couple more breaths. And then slowly start to open the eyes, maybe having a soft gaze at the floor in front of you just to come back into the room if your eyes were closed. And we'll start with our first posture. So I'd recommend coming into Sukhasana, or this cross-legged pose, but you can stay kneeling if that works better for you. Now, just a quick thing about yin. When we practice yin, we work at about 60% of our normal stretch capacity, because you'll notice we hold the poses for a lot longer, and while we're in them, you can kind of start to feel the tissues change. And if you start off really intense in the stretch, you probably are not going to feel great by the end of it. And the idea is that it's meant to be really rejuvenating and not like torture. So start off easy, and if you need to adjust and move in a little bit deeper as you go into it, that's fine. But we'll see how this feels with this first one. So you'll take your hands to your right hip crease and clasp them over on your hip crease. Now, the other option here is that you can sit on your left hand and then your right hand can kind of just be out to the side. I like to clasp in my hip crease here. It just kind of gives me something to anchor into, but try both and see what works. And then you'll drop your right ear over towards your right shoulder, and notice the point where you just feel a gentle tug. And you'll feel a little tug on the skin on the side of the neck and maybe into the top of the shoulder, and that's where you'll stay. So you can close or soften the eyes here. And then notice if you can drop your left shoulder a little bit more. See if there's an element of being able to stay in the pose, but finding some softness in areas that you don't need to hold yourself here. Maybe you're already beginning to notice that the posture feels a little bit different from when we first started it. And we're just here for a couple more breaths. Now keep the head exactly as it is and release the hands. You take your right hand to your right cheek and gently help your head back up. And then just take a pause there. You can keep the eyes open or closed, but notice if you can feel any changes in the tissues on the left side of the neck and the shoulder. Something we'll focus on a bit tonight is this sensation of hydration in the tissues. So maybe you can already start to notice that feeling. The tissues feeling a bit more rejuvenated. And when we work with the tissues here, they're kind of like, you can imagine them like a sponge. So the fascia that we're working with, this connective tissue, is that when you stretch it, you kind of wring out the sponge and get all the fluids out. And then when you let go of the stretch like we just did, your body draws in fluids and even more fluids than were there before, and it continues for hours afterwards. So that's why sometimes this yin practice can feel a bit like a massage. And maybe you're noticing a little bit of that, a little bit of a different feeling on the left side from the right. So we'll go over towards the other side now. Clasp your hands, and you can switch the cross of your legs too if your legs are crossed. Clasp your hands towards your left hip crease. Or you can sit on your right hand if that feels better. And then drop your left ear over towards your left shoulder. Again, just to that sensation where you feel a gentle tug. See if you can soften the right shoulder blade down a little bit more. And then maybe begin to imagine this idea of the tissues kind of wringing out fluids right now as you stretch them. You allow your right hip to feel a little bit heavier here. Maybe creating a sense of spaciousness in the right side body. Now we're just here for about 3 more breaths. And maybe you can start to tune into the sensations of the changes in the tissues a little bit more here. Now keep the head exactly as it is. Release the hands. Use your left hand against your left cheek to just press your head back up. And then pause here, maybe with the eyes closed. Allowing yourself a few breaths to gather information about what's happening in the tissues. Beginning to notice the subtle changes here. I know for me, sometimes after I do that, I feel a little bit taller already. And then we're going to move into our next pose. So this is called broken toe pose, which is an evil name for a somewhat evil pose, I guess. It's actually like my favorite. But most people feel the sensation of the tissues wringing out in this one for sure. So a couple things to make this a little bit more comfortable is that you can take a blanket underneath your knees just for a little bit of padding if that feels good. You also can lessen the intensity of the pose if you take a blanket and sit it between your heels and your bottom. So here the toes are completely tucked under, and I like to take my hands. I would recommend don't get into the pose quite yet because we'll wait till I actually start the timer so you're not there longer than you have to be. But you'll tuck under all 10 toes, so help the pinkies because they like to stay out of the equation sometimes. And then just experiment. Like if you come all the way back, you might find that that's like already too intense, and we're going to be here for a little bit. So just pay attention to that. So start out, I'd recommend with your hands forward, maybe even grab one of your blocks so that you can bring the ground a little bit closer to your hands, and then start to play with what it feels like to bring your weight back. I'm going to take out the blanket from behind my bottom here and then give you a second to get into the pose, find a version that works, and we're just going to hold it for 1 minute. I'll let you know when I start the timer. All right, so go ahead and sit back into your version of it. And if it starts out too intense, remember you can just come out of it, take some of the weight off. Now see if you can relax the muscles around the jaw here. Softening the shoulders. And just take 2 more rounds of breath. You're almost there. And then gently start to lean your weight forward. You might like to come onto all fours and give your toes a little bit of a tap on the ground. You can feel, for me this is really vivid, I can feel fluids and circulation back into the feet here. You can sit back onto the heels for kind of a little baby counter pose if that feels good. But just take a couple moments here to tune into your awareness of your feet. Just allowing yourself to experience whatever it is that you experience in this moment. There's no right or wrong. And then we'll come into the next pose here. So grab your blocks or whatever you're using as blocks. And then grab your blanket. And you're going to take your blanket, mine's folded like yay big, and you're going to just roll it up. Doesn't really matter too much, doesn't have to be perfect. But mine's probably like 6 inches, like 10 centimeters, no bigger than that, 14 centimeters. Sorry, trying to translate for my metric system users. So grab your blanket and place it across your mat and come into all fours, have your blocks nearby. You're just gonna step your right foot forward. So we're coming into a low lunge, but before we get into it, take that blanket roll and tuck it up underneath the top of the thigh just before the thigh meets the knee. So it's just gonna be a little support, a little bit of a break there, because again, we don't wanna come into the deepest version of this pose because we're gonna hold it for a little bit, and this one can also tend to be a little intense. Grab your blocks or whatever you're using to put your hands on to bring the floor a little bit closer to you. And remember, 60%. So usually that's just when you feel the tug of the tissues there. And go ahead and settle into it. Bring some attention and awareness to the back of the left hip. Notice if you're clenching any muscles here and if you can soften and release them. And then see how that changes the pose for the front of the hip. This tends to be an area that feels really tight and stuck. Can you just send some breath to the front of the left hip? And see if that helps you soften in a little bit more. And we're here for about 5 more rounds of breath. So notice in these last few breaths if there's anything else in the pose that you can let go of. Now really gently start to press into that right foot and send your hips back a little bit more so that you can gently come out of the pose. Couple options here. You can pause in between in child's pose, sit back on your heels, or you can send the legs out long and kind of give them a shake out, which is my favorite. Whatever you choose, just make sure that you enter into it with softness and give yourself the opportunity to pay attention to what's going on the left side of the body. Again, can be quite vivid in terms of that sensation of the tissues feeling like they're rejuvenating and rehydrating. Can imagine that sponge analogy, if that's helpful, of just drawing in fluids. Give yourself just a couple more breaths there before we move on. And then keeping that blanket roll again in the middle of your mat. Start off in all fours, have your blocks nearby, and then you'll step your left foot forward this time. Coming into a low lunge, first get that blanket into a position where it's pressing into the top of the right thigh just above the knee, so it can act as a brake so your body weight doesn't keep pressing you forward and deeper into the pose. And then grab your props, your blocks that will help bring the ground closer to your hands so that you can practice at that 60% of your capacity. And then settle into the pose. Maybe you'll notice right away that this side feels really different from the other side. Maybe for you it feels the same. Can you take the first few breaths to soften into the tissue on the back of the right hip? Notice if you're gripping or clenching there. Can you introduce some more ease? And then allow that sense of ease to drift towards the front of the right thigh, the right hip crease. Softening in a little bit more. And we're just here for about 3 more breaths. And then gently begin to press your left foot into the mat a little bit more. Press into the hands and send the weight back into the hips just so you can slowly come out of the pose. Same options again. You can take child's pose, sit back on your heels, or send the legs out long and lean back. You don't have to choose the same thing every time. Take a few breaths here to just gather some information about how you feel. How have the tissues changed in your hips? And then from here, I'm going to move my blocks out of the way. Probably won't need them again. You might want them for one more pose, but just move them off to the side. And then we're going to come down onto the mat. So make sure you have props nearby that you want for Shavasana. We've got a few poses before we get there, but grab your blankets and everything. And then I'm going to make out of my blanket a little pillow. So I'm just going to fold it into a like long rectangle just so I can lay my head on it. So we're going to come down to lay on our side. I'm going to come to lay on my right side first. And you want to send, if you're on your right side, your right arm out in front of you. So straight out in front of you. And then legs can do whatever you want that feels supportive. So knees bent is good. Up to you. Take your left arm up towards the ceiling, and then you'll turn your left palm so it faces the wall behind you. And then you'll drape the back of your hand somewhere across your low back. Maybe that hand can start to sneak underneath the right side waist. So I'll just show you. My hand looks like this behind my back. So it's just draping there if you don't have the space to tuck it underneath the side waist. It doesn't matter. And we're going to stay in more of a side lying position, but I want you to start to allow the left shoulder to drop back behind you a little bit. So I'm just rocking a little bit backwards and then allowing my left shoulder to drop down, and then let gravity do the rest of the work. So again, this doesn't have to be a big sensation here because we're going to stay here for a little while. But see if you can allow the left shoulder to drop back a little bit more without moving too much, more so just melting into the tissues here. Feeling this gentle tug and sensation on the front of the right, or front of the left shoulder, the left pec. And then notice how this pose doesn't require much effort from you. So see if there's areas in your body where you're still holding on. If you can allow yourself to release them so that you can approach this with a little bit more ease. And we're just here for a few more breaths. And gently begin to release the left arm and just lay it across your left side. Giving yourself a few breaths here to give some attention to the left shoulder. Maybe noticing some subtle changes in the tissues there. And then from here, you can, if your knees are bent towards the right side, you can simply just peel your left side of your body and your upper body over so that you come into a supine twist. So really easy if your knees are bent, you're kind of almost in that position already. I'm going to remove the blanket from behind my head just so that I can neutralize my cervical spine a little bit more. And I'm going to take that blanket and stick it between my knees just to give myself a little bit of extra support. So arms can be out in a T in your supine twist, or they can come into kind of cactus arms, or maybe you want your arms to be more overhead, whatever feels good to you. Just allow yourself the first couple breaths to set yourself up well so that you can really soften into this one. Bring some awareness to the tissues on the back of the left hip. See if you can allow yourself to let go a little bit more there. And then notice if that sense of softness can drift up the spine. Introducing the sensation of letting go in the spine. All the way up to the sides of the neck. Allowing the head to feel heavy on the ground beneath you. And we'll be here for about 3 more breaths. And gently start to remove any props you have maybe in between your legs. Just set them to the side and then come back to center. You can either take your feet to the width of the mat, so knees are bent, soles of the feet on the mat, and then allow the knees to knock in towards each other. It's a nice release for the low back, or you can come into a mini shavasana. And give yourself a couple breaths here to notice the differences in each side of the body. And then we'll come into the same series of poses on the other side. So if you had a little pillow and you liked that, you can grab your pillow again. And then this time, coming to lie down on the left side of the body. So take your left arm straight out in front of you on the ground. And you kind of want to be on the shoulder blade more than like the head of the shoulder here. So I guess your weight's a little bit back behind you to start off with. And then reach your right arm up towards the ceiling. Turn your palm so that your palm is facing back behind you. And then take that hand somewhere in your back, maybe your low back, or maybe tuck it into the side waist here. And then still staying in this side lying position, gently start to rock your right shoulder back a little bit in space, and then allow it to drop back behind you. You should feel a gentle tug on the front of the right shoulder. And then again here, notice how little effort you can put into this posture to keep yourself here. Allow the front of the right shoulder to soften a little bit more. Allow gravity to help pull the back side of the right shoulder down in space a little bit more. And then just be here for a couple more breaths. Gently release the right arm from behind you and then just take your right arm down your side. Maybe feeling that sensation of fluid coming back into the tissues. And then we're going to come into a supine twist again. So you can come through center or just stay with your knees over towards the left. I'm going to remove my pillow again and take the blanket in between my thighs just for a little extra support. And then taking the arms out to a T, dropping the upper body over towards the right now so that the backs of the shoulder blades are resting on the mat beneath you. Again, you could take whatever position with your arms feels most useful here. And then see if you can start with some awareness in the back of the right hip. Breathing some softness into this area. And then allowing that same sense of ease to drift up the spine, into the low back, between the shoulders, and up the sides of the neck, allowing the head to feel heavy. And then allow yourself just a few more breaths here to find some areas that you can soften into a little bit more. And gently release the prop if you've got one between your legs or underneath your knees. Gently cinch in around the waist just to draw yourself back to center. And then you can take the same two options, so soles of the feet on the mat a little bit wider than the hips, knees knock in together in constructive rest, or you can take a mini shavasana. Just a couple breaths here. Maybe the sides feel similar now. Maybe they still feel different. And then we've got just one more pose before we head into shavasana. So trying to not move too much, keeping yourself relaxed, just make another roll with your blanket like you did before, or alternatively you can use a block. This is just kind of nice because it's a little bit softer. Just grab a blanket roll or a block, or if you've got a bolster, you could also use that too. So come into onto lying on your back, soles of the feet on the mat, knees bent up towards the ceiling, and your feet can be about hip width apart. Just going to press down into your feet to lift the hips up and slide that prop underneath your sacrum, so that flat triangle bone on the back of your pelvis. Make sure you can feel the sensation of your low back just draping off of that. So it's not supported by it, but it's kind of hanging freely in space there. So you can get a little release in the low back. This is option one, is to stay here. Option two is to start to pick up the feet so that the soles of your feet go up towards the ceiling. Option three is to allow the knees to bend a little bit more so that the weight can come more over your hips, letting the thighs kind of rest on each other. It doesn't matter which one you pick, but we'll just be here for a couple minutes. Trying to allow your feet to feel really soft here. Allowing the pelvis and the hips to be heavy. And if your feet are up towards the ceiling, slowly start to bend the knees, placing one foot onto the ground and then the other. Pausing in this supported bridge pose for a moment. Maybe feeling that sensation of the blood flow coming back into the feet. And then press the soles of the feet down into the mat to lift up the hips and remove the prop from underneath you. And we're heading for shavasana, so I'm going to take that blanket and lay it behind my head and create just a little roll on the bottom edge of it to fill the space behind my cervical spine. I'm going to grab my other blanket just to cover me up because it's a little bit cold. You can also grab your other blanket and create a roll to put underneath your knees. That can feel really supportive. So I'm going to grab my bolster, put it under my knees. Blanket's going over the top of me. And then that little roll for behind my neck. And then just allow yourself the opportunity to be still here. allow the bones to feel heavy. Muscles soft, like they're draping off of the bones. And if you've got time and you want to stay in Shavasana a little bit longer, I welcome you to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to start to walk the rest of us out of it. So slowly start to wiggle your fingers and toes. And then allow yourself to roll off to one side, pausing there for a moment. Maybe noticing any changes in the body when you first started the class. And then using your top hand to support you, press into the ground to slowly come back up to a seat. And then I invite you to pause here again with the eyes closed, same way that we started the practice. Giving yourself the opportunity to maybe tune in a little bit more to those changes in the tissues. Maybe you feel a little bit more rejuvenated, connected. And then bringing the hands to heart center if that's meaningful to you, and bowing the head in gratitude for this practice. Thank you.